I was born in St. Lucia in 1979 and immigrated to Canada when I was about 5 years old. We lived here until I was about 9, then moved to Antigua for several years before returning to Canada when I was about 13. These are my first memories of racism in this country. I was in grade 8 and my family moved to Pickering. I was one of 4 black people in the school. I remember being bullied because of my accent, my skin, my hair, microaggressions from teachers who only praised me for athleticism, although I was one of the smartest students in the class. In high school, I started having encounters with the police, being pulled over while I was walking home because I fit the description. Black. Wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt. I remember being about 16, looking for shoes in Foot Locker with my parents, and having an undercover police whisper in my ear, "I know what you're doing, don't even think about it." Getting denied entrance to Buffalo while traveling with friends, needing to turn back without good explanation. I have a particularly salient memory of traveling back from a visit to the Caribbean. I was again about 16 and was traveling alone back to Canada through Tampa Airport. I was randomly selected for a bag search. I thought that the border security was taking an excessive amount of time, and I became increasingly agitated and started accusing them of being racist and violating my rights. Something that they didn't take well, and I was threatened, humiliated, made a spectacle of, detained at Tampa Airport for nearly the entire day. I could tell you many more stories about car searches and being pulled over by the police. My experiences are not particularly sensational, but that's kind of the point. Most anti-black racism in Canada isn't. It's systemic rather than individualistic. It's covert rather than overt. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve our attention or action to change it. At the same time as the horrific George Floyd murder weeks ago, the Amy Cooper-Chris Cooper confrontation in Central Park took place. If you've not seen the videotaped footage, it's an important watch. Amy Cooper lashed out at a black man who was birdwatching in Central Park because he asked her to put her dog on a leash, and she effectively used her white privilege to try to punish him. This almost scared me more than the blatant police brutality that was all over our TV screens, because it's a form of racism that is usually unseen, and it occurs under the guise of being a good civilian or some other self-righteous delusion to explain away the racist behavior after the fact. Only days after both of these incidents occurred, I was very disturbed by a story told to me by close friends of mine. Their 8-year-old son, who's black, was playing with another 8-year-old child who's white. The boys had a disagreement about the rules of a game, and the white child told my friend's son that he hoped that the police kill him like they did the man on the television. While his comment was triggered by the George Floyd case, it immediately reminded me of Amy Cooper. This little boy was a young Amy Cooper, who invoked his 8-year-old white privilege on my friend's son. One of the sick, insidious things about anti-black racism is that I don't think that most people realize that they harbor these beliefs until the conditions present themselves. Fear, stress, feeling disrespected by someone who should know their place. It's a sad reminder to me, although I've never forgotten, that racism is alive and well in Canada. Not because the Prime Minister said so recently, or because there are protests in major cities in Canada, and not because the Canadian Human Rights Commission said, and I quote, "It is time for all Canadians to acknowledge that anti-black racism is pervasive in Canada." But because to a person, if you're black and live here, you've lived it. And this particular comment made towards my friend's son, although technically nonviolent, is still violent and affects our most vulnerable. While watching the news and BLM protests, we also need to acknowledge the impact that this has had on young black children. My wife and I were watching the CNN coverage of George Floyd when it first was made public. My son walked into the room and I paused it. I had this moment where I was like, how much information should my 11-year-old black son have about what's happening in North America? He knows about racism, We've had those conversations. But should he know about this? My wife and I sat there and watched the coverage with him for about 15 minutes, during which he saw the video of George Floyd being murdered by the police. We had a long conversation with him about it, and also spent time coaching him how to speak with the police and other people in authority. He's 11. I struggle with this because I'm a child psychologist, and I understand the impact of stress on children. I was balancing this tension of, damn, I really don't want him to lose his innocence around this, with, I really need him to be woke and to be ready to protect himself. And what are we talking about protecting him from? Well, picture for the moment the story of a boy named Johnny in my practice, okay? He's black and his parents immigrated from the Caribbean to Toronto. His father was deported back to the Caribbean before he was even born. Mother, now a single parent, and has few supports in the country because of serial migration. She has several abusive relationships with partners. In the first few years of Johnny's life, Johnny witnesses domestic violence. On a single income, she lives in community housing. Johnny starts to see things he shouldn't. He's undersupervised and witnesses violence in the community. When he goes to grade 1, he's slow to pick up reading. Mom is underemployed and stressed, and doesn't have the emotional resources to support him at home with his work. He starts getting bullied at school about it. He retaliates, gets into trouble at the office a lot. Things progress, and now he's having emotional outbursts that last hours at home and school. Mom tries to control it with corporal punishment, and at school he's being restrained by staff daily. He then begins hurting other kids and staff, throwing chairs, destroying property, yelling that he wishes he were dead, and that he's going to kill his peers at school. Mom is being called on a regular basis to pick him up. By about grade 3, the school puts him on half days and starts requesting a psych assessment. He's diagnosed with ADHD, ODD, conduct disorder, and intellectual disability. He gets placed in a behavior classroom. He starts to think that he's stupid. His schooling gets disrupted while Mom is awaiting permanent housing, and they're forced to move several times within a 3-year period. The board then appoints a social worker to help out. Johnny tells the social worker one day that his mom hit him with a shoe when he was sent home because of bad behavior. Child Protection Services are now involved. Johnny blames himself and wishes he never said anything. Mom revokes consent for Johnny to meet with the social worker. We fast forward to the age of 16, and Johnny's placed in a group home. He's being charged with several offenses, is on a second diversion program, is a heavy marijuana smoker, rarely attends school, has a delinquent peer group, and he's in grade 10 and has only 1 credit. Why did I tell you about Johnny? Because his life was heavily impacted by systemic racist practices in this country. The established social and political institutions in Canada too often put black families and their children in these situations, starting with our immigration policies and deportation practices, which disrupt the support structures and place many families in a socially and an economically disadvantaged state. Then there's the school system labeling him as a behavior problem, and finally with the child protection and justice systems who have a very lengthy history of disproportionately apprehending and arresting black youth. Perhaps this all looks different if Johnny's dad wasn't deported, or if affordable housing didn't equate to unsafe living, or if teachers, principals, clinicians didn't stereotypically view Johnny as a gangster or a truant, but instead understood him as a trauma survivor. Johnny is a survivor of what we call ACEs. These are adverse childhood experiences, and they disproportionately affect non-whites because of systemic racism. ACEs include things like being subject to sexual or physical abuse, exposure to domestic violence, growing up with a parent who has significant mental health needs or who abuses alcohol. However, there are experiences that occur outside of the home that are just as traumatic, like felt discrimination, juvenile justice involvement, foster care, school suspensions and expulsions, and witnessed community violence. ACEs have a dose-response relationship with risk factors for the leading causes of death in North America, like alcoholism, use of illicit drugs, sexual promiscuity, STIs, obesity, suicide attempts, as well as many disease conditions like heart disease, chronic bronchitis, emphysema, cancer, and hepatitis. Johnny has lots of resiliency factors, and maybe his trajectory would have been different if he had just a couple of aces, but the cards are really stacked against him. The cumulative effect of these traumas puts the body's stress response system into hyperdrive. Johnny's body is doing what it's supposed to do. It's protecting itself by getting ready to fight off threats. The problem is that he's now in a chronic state of threat, and the hormones that are being produced to help have gone haywire and are chronically present, and are present in such excess that it's toxic. This is toxic stress. And Johnny and all the people around him are likely unaware. The fish is the last to discover water. Instead, he's being viewed as another sad statistic. He believes all of the lack-based invalidating messages he's heard and received over time. And he's at risk for all the mental and physical health problems I cited earlier. So what do we do about this? I remember when Jay-Z was employed by the NFL. The sentiment was that this was done to improve race relations after Colin Kaepernick started the movement of taking a knee. But one of the criticisms levied against Jay-Z was that he was bowing to the will of the owners, legitimizing what was illegitimate regarding the treatment of Kaepernick, selling out. And his response was that it was time to move the conversation forward. Well, for once, the movement to address anti-black racism is garnering worldwide attention. Nobody should distract from that narrative. I can't tell you the number of times in the past few weeks I've heard people say all lives matter, or watched organizations launch diversity, equity, inclusion task groups to address all forms of racism. All of these things distract from the narrative and drive me crazy. And I get it. We need to focus now on a willingness to have the conversation about anti-black racism in Canada. And we also need to be ready with the substance to move this conversation forward. So let's try to do a little bit of both here, awareness and action. Our children are suffering. While our attention is tuned and turned to the police, brutality, victims, protests, riots, and hashtag Black Lives Matter, understand that young black children are suffering behind this as well. I'm grieving because of it, and so are many of you. Some of you are at different stages of it: sadness, anger, denial, don't want to talk about it. Don't let anyone tell you how to mourn this. But if you're appalled by what happened to George Floyd or Rayshard Brooks, be appalled by what happened to them when they were younger, and by how their kids will now be affected. Their deaths are the cumulative effects of long-standing, heinous exposure to adverse events, systemic anti-black racism being just one of them. Mourn their loss of innocence. Be angry that they've been mistreated and misunderstood. Be angry that the systems designed to protect them have perpetrated the problems and ultimately killed them. For allies, the raw emotions are doing what they're intended to do. They require attunement and validation, not punishment or suppression. So tune in. If you do that, you will feel some modicum of what others are already feeling, and your emotions will guide and inform what you should do next, if you listen to them. If you're not grieving yet, it probably means that you haven't tuned in, so be more curious. Suspend your judgments and park what you think you know. Listen and take the personal charge to learn more. It starts with each of us individually. Once we're tuned in, the difficult work starts. Acknowledgement without change continues to just put lipstick on the pig. Let's start looking at our systems that impact youth and asking the hard questions. Is there a diversity of ideas in our executive structures? Is there really such a thing as universal programs that meet the needs of all? Clinicians, doctors, lawyers, judges are the questions we don't ask rooted in systemic bias that is maybe perpetuating these problems with school failure, apprehensions, health risk, and incarceration. I'm a board member of the Psychology Foundation of Canada. The mandate of PFC is to foster resiliency in children, and that means all children. That includes Black children. We are taking stock of our own internal practices, asking hard questions of each other, connecting with our community partners, learning together, and figuring out how we can best execute our mandate in light of what we know about systemic racist practices in Canada. And I personally charge us all to take this moment for individual reflection about our young people, the atrocities they've already endured, and those that they will continue to endure if we sit this one out. Don't sit this one out. We're not.